For Europe, the Ottoman Empire was a nightmare. For generations, fortress after fortress collapsed beneath Ottoman cannons. Cities fell, borders vanished. The Ottomans were called conquerors, and in their eyes, other kingdoms were not rivals. They were territories waiting to be absorbed. But in 1476, something unthinkable happened. Hungary stopped defending. After years of standing still, it chose to strike. Hungarian forces moved through forests, crossed rivers, and attacked where the Ottomans never expected a war to begin. An empire built on besieging the walls of others now found itself on the opposite side. For weeks, cannon fire echoed through the night. Trenches were dug meters deep, and the roles of attacker and defender were reversed. All to reclaim a single fortress that had once belonged to Europe, and to halt the Ottoman advance, not everywhere, but here, Šabac. By 1476, Southeast Europe had reached a turning point. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had been expanding through the Balkans. At first, this expansion looked temporary. Armies arrived, fought, and withdrew. But over time, that pattern changed. Ottoman control became permanent. Serbia fell under Ottoman rule. Bosnia followed. Garrisons no longer left at the end of a campaign. They stayed, fortified, and supplied. For the Kingdom of Hungary, this created a new and dangerous reality. Hungary had long depended on a simple defensive system. Distance slowed enemies. Rivers blocked them. Border fortresses bought time. As long as the Ottoman presence south of Hungary remained unstable, this system worked. By the mid-1470s, it no longer did. The frontier was no longer a line that could be watched. It was becoming a zone of constant pressure. One river mattered more than all the others: the Sava River. The Sava connected the Balkans directly to Central Europe. It could carry soldiers. It could carry supplies. It could carry artillery. Whoever controlled the Sava controlled how war moved north. This is why the fortress of Šabac became so important. Šabac stood on the southern bank of the river. In earlier decades, the area belonged to a shifting frontier zone linked to Hungarian influence and allied Serbian rulers. During the Ottoman advance, Šabac was captured and rebuilt. Under Ottoman control, it was no longer just a defensive fortress. It became an operational base. From Šabac, Ottoman forces could cross the river and return safely. Raiding parties no longer risked being trapped. Scouts could observe Hungarian territory without committing to battle. More importantly, future campaigns into Hungary could begin from behind strong walls and a protected river crossing. This was the danger Hungary faced. As long as the Ottomans held Šabac, the Sava River stopped protecting Hungary. Instead, it worked in the Ottomans' favor. At first, Hungary responded the way it always had. More patrols along the river, stronger defenses on the northern bank, greater vigilance. But these measures only delayed the problem. They did not remove it. King Matthias Corvinus understood this clearly. If Hungary remained behind its rivers, the Ottomans would choose when and where war began. Hungary would always react, never initiate, never control the timing. That situation was unacceptable. So the question changed. It was no longer how to defend the Sava River. It was whether the fortress across the river could be allowed to remain. Šabac became the focus. Attacking it was not about conquest. It was about removing a forward Ottoman position that made Hungary vulnerable. This decision marked a shift in strategy. Hungary would no longer rely only on defense. For the first time in years, it would move south of the river. Preparations began immediately. The army would need speed. It could not stay long in Ottoman-controlled territory. If the siege dragged on, Ottoman reinforcements would arrive. Everything depended on timing. The campaign would begin at Šabac. After the decision to strike Šabac was made, the Hungarian army did not rush forward. There was a pause, not hesitation, but calculation. Commanders understood exactly what was at stake. Once the army crossed the Sava River, it would be operating on Ottoman-controlled ground. Retreat would be difficult. If the operation failed, the army could be trapped on the southern bank, exposed to forces moving in from deeper inside the Balkans. This meant the crossing itself could not fail. Preparation came first. Plans were finalized quietly. Boats were gathered days in advance. Crossing points were chosen carefully based on terrain and visibility. Some crossing sites were close to Šabac, allowing a direct approach. Others were deliberately farther away, intended to confuse Ottoman scouts and delay any organized response. Supply trains were reduced to the minimum. Only what could move quickly was taken forward. Anything that slowed the army was left behind. Speed would matter more than strength. When preparations were complete, the army began to move. The march toward the river was controlled and deliberate. Orders were brief. Columns stayed tight. Noise was kept low. Hungarian units reached the northern bank of the Sava and halted. This was the final moment before commitment. On the far side of the water lay hostile ground. Once the crossing began, there would be no safe pause. Then the crossing started. Boats entered the river in sequence, not all at once. Men boarded without ceremony. Horses were guided carefully, kept calm to avoid chaos. Weapons, armor, and supplies were passed hand to hand. The river itself was an enemy. It was wide. Its banks were exposed. An army caught mid-crossing could not fight or retreat effectively. For a brief time, the Hungarian force was at its most vulnerable. But the movement did not stop. As the first units reached the southern bank, they did not wait for the rest. They formed ranks immediately. Scouts moved ahead to secure the surrounding ground. Commanders pushed the force forward before the Ottomans could react. Only after enough troops had crossed did the army begin to stabilize its position. The crossing was complete. The Hungarian army now stood south of the Sava River. From that moment on, time turned against them. Every delay increased the chance of Ottoman reinforcements arriving from the interior. Every pause made withdrawal less likely. The campaign had entered its most dangerous phase. Inside Šabac, Ottoman defenders soon saw the reality for themselves. Hungarian banners were visible on the southern bank. Movements once considered unlikely were now unfolding in front of their eyes. The river had been crossed. The threat was no longer theoretical. The fortress of Šabac was now directly in the path of the advancing army, and the siege was about to begin. Once the Hungarian army appeared south of the river, there was no confusion inside Šabac, no panic, no disorder. The Ottoman garrison had expected this moment. Šabac was not a frontier town held lightly. It was a fortress built to absorb pressure. Inside the walls, the response was immediate and structured. Gates were secured. Watch posts were reinforced. Signals were sent to surrounding positions. Commanders moved through the fortress with purpose. Each man already knew his assignment. This was not the first time the garrison had prepared for siege. Their role was not to chase enemies in the field. It was to endure. Artillery crews moved to their positions overlooking the approaches. Guns were aligned to control the open ground between the fortress and the river. Every path leading toward the walls was covered. Supplies were checked carefully. Food stores were counted. Water sources protected. Ammunition redistributed to the sectors most likely to be attacked. Šabac had been stocked for exactly this kind of situation. The defenders understood their advantage. They were behind stone. They were supported by prepared positions. Time, for now, worked for them. If the Hungarians hesitated, relief forces would come. If the siege dragged on, pressure would shift. From the walls, Ottoman observers watched the Hungarian army organize itself. They could see formations taking shape. They could see the space where siege works would likely begin. They could predict where the first pressure would fall. What they did not know was how quickly the attackers would act. That uncertainty mattered. Inside the fortress, discipline remained firm. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, only routine. Men rotated through watch duty. Repairs were made where needed. Orders were repeated to ensure nothing was misunderstood. Šabac had been designed to resist, not to intimidate. Its purpose was simple: hold long enough. Long enough for help to arrive. Long enough for the attackers to make a mistake. Long enough for pressure to break elsewhere. As the night approached, torches appeared along the walls. The Hungarian army was close now, close enough to be seen, close enough to be measured. Both sides understood the next phase was unavoidable. The crossing was over. The approach was complete. Now the siege would decide everything. The siege did not begin with an assault. It began with positioning. At first light, Hungarian commanders ordered the army to spread out across the open ground, facing the fortress. Not randomly, deliberately. Units were placed to control movement around Sabac. Paths leading to the river were watched. Open approaches were measured for distance and cover. The goal was simple. Cut the fortress off, then apply pressure. Siege works began immediately. Earth was moved. Wood was brought forward. Protective screens were raised to shield men from fire coming off the walls. This was careful work, not dramatic work. Every step was calculated. Hungarian artillery followed close behind. Guns were positioned where they could strike the walls while remaining protected. Crews adjusted angles and range. Shots were tested, then corrected. Only when everything was ready did the firing begin. The first cannon shots echoed across the river valley. Stones shook. Dust rose from the walls. The fortress answered almost at once. Ottoman guns returned fire from prepared positions. Shots struck the ground around the attackers. Fragments flew. The siege had entered its active phase. Both sides now understood the rhythm that would follow. The attackers would push forward, slowly and methodically. The defenders would respond from behind stone, forcing the attackers to work for every step. This was not a battle meant to be decided in a single day. Hungarian commanders knew that rushing the walls would be costly. They chose pressure over speed. Each advance was covered, each position reinforced before the next was attempted. Inside the fortress, the defenders adjusted quickly. Fire was concentrated on new siege works as they appeared. Guns were shifted to meet changes in the attackers' positions. Nothing was wasted. The first day ended without a breach, but the meaning was clear. Šabac was now under full siege. The fortress was surrounded. The guns were in place, and the struggle had moved from preparation to endurance. What followed would not be decided by courage alone. It would be decided by time. In the days that followed the opening bombardment, the siege entered its second phase. This was no longer about positioning, it was about sustained fighting. Hungarian artillery continued firing at the same sections of wall targeted on the first day. Shots were not spread across the fortress, they were concentrated. Stone was struck again and again. Mortar began to fail. Dust and debris fell from the battlements. This was deliberate. The goal was not an immediate breach. It was to weaken the walls until they could no longer be repaired under fire. Ottoman defenders responded as they had been trained to do. Guns on the walls fired back at regular intervals. They targeted Hungarian artillery crews and earthworks. Several guns were hit. Some crews were forced to abandon their positions temporarily. Casualties mounted on both sides. Men were wounded by splinters and fragments. Equipment was damaged. No day passed without loss. As the days went on, the fighting intensified. Hungarian sappers began advancing trenches closer to the fortress. They worked mostly at night, moving earth forward under cover of darkness. By morning, new positions appeared closer to the walls. Ottoman gunners adjusted quickly. When trenches came within effective range, fire increased. Cannon and small arms swept the approaches. Several trench sections were damaged or collapsed, forcing repairs under fire. At least twice, Ottoman defenders launched short sorties from the gates. These were not attempts to break the siege. They were sudden strikes. Small groups rushed out, attacked exposed positions, destroyed tools and equipment, and withdrew before Hungarian units could respond in force. These clashes were brief but violent. They slowed the attackers, but they did not stop the advance. By the end of the first week, the situation had changed. Sections of the wall showed visible damage. Repairs became harder to complete as Hungarian fire grew more accurate. Some Ottoman guns fired less frequently, either damaged or conserving ammunition. Hungarian commanders observed these changes carefully. They noted which parts of the wall responded more slowly. They identified areas where repair work was becoming dangerous for the defenders. The siege was achieving its purpose. Šabac had not fallen, but it was no longer intact. By the close of this phase, both sides understood the situation clearly. The defenders could still hold, but holding was becoming more costly each day. The attackers had not yet broken through, but the fortress was weakening. The siege was moving toward its breaking point. The end came not through surprise, but through exhaustion. By the second week of the siege, the situation inside Šabac had become critical. Hungarian artillery had focused its fire on one section of the wall for days. Stone had been shattered, mortar had failed, temporary repairs no longer held. Each attempt to rebuild was met with immediate fire. Ottoman defenders could no longer safely stand on that section of the wall. This was the turning point. Once the wall could not be manned, it could not be defended. Hungarian commanders acted quickly. Artillery increased its rate of fire to keep defenders away from the breach. At the same time, infantry units were ordered forward. Covered by smoke and cannon fire, Hungarian soldiers advanced toward the damaged wall. They were met by resistance. Small arms fire came from nearby positions. Missiles were thrown from remaining towers. But the defense was fragmented. There was no longer a continuous line of fire. The breach widened. Stones collapsed inward. Defenders fell back from the opening to avoid being cut down. At this point, the Ottoman garrison faced a final choice: continue fighting inside a broken fortress or preserve what remained of the force. Holding the walls was no longer possible. Fighting street by street would have meant heavy losses with no chance of relief in time. The commanders chose to abandon the fortress. Some units withdrew deeper into Ottoman territory. Others surrendered when escape was no longer possible. By the end of the day, Šabac was under Hungarian control. The Ottomans had not been destroyed in open battle. They had been forced out by sustained pressure that made defense impossible. That was how Šabac fell. For Hungary, the victory was clear. The fortress was secured. The Sava River crossing was no longer in Ottoman hands. For the Ottomans, the defeat was tactical, but real. They lost a key forward base. They lost control of the river crossing, and they lost the ability to threaten Hungary from that position. The siege proved something important. The Ottomans could be beaten not by a single charge, but by breaking their ability to hold ground. At Šabac, that is exactly what happened.